Hey, welcome to Journey at Home. My name is Jarrod. I'm the Director of Adult and Student Ministries here at Journey Church, and we're in a series called Behind My Journey. We're talking to some folks. They're telling their real stories about how their faith has been developed, and we hope these stories are going to encourage you guys. Hey, thanks for joining us today, guys. Let me introduce you to my friend named Paul Corder. You guys probably know him. He is a worship leader for the band, but Paul, tell us about Paul that we don't know.
Oh, the Paul you don't know. The Paul you don't know doesn't have that much more exciting of a life. Outside of what I do here as a worship leader, I work for Hub International, formerly known as Peel and Holland, here in town as the sales director. I've been there, it'll be 4 years on August. My wife, Diane, and I have been married for 13 years in October.
Yeah.
Got a 6-year-old, Nash, and then an 8-month-old, Jude. And outside of that, we survive.
You just do life,
We
right?
survive,
That's
yeah.
awesome. Hey, I'm sure there's lots of stories there, but really what we want to dive into today, Paul, is you just kind of share your story. You have a really interesting story of growth and faith over the past few years, decades. So I just want to jump in and say, hey, how did you even begin this journey of following Jesus? What did that look like for you?
Well, it happened when I was 9 years old. My family and I had just moved to Kentucky and went to a small church out in the country, and we went to a revival on a Thursday night, and I'll never forget just how do I put this? You kind of have those moments where you almost get scared into salvation. And at 9 years old, I will admit that I was scared to death coming out of that church service that night. I remember waking my dad up at like 3 a.m, and I was like, Dad, like, I don't want to go to hell. And he was like, what? And I was like, no, we need to talk about me being a Christian. Like, I want to dive into that at 9 years old. And so at 9 years old, I was saved. And, you know, it's interesting, right? Because I don't know that at 9 years old I truly knew what that meant. So it was probably later on in adulthood when, like, I truly understood what salvation meant and what being saved meant, and understood, like, how to lead my life accordingly.
Yeah. But you knew at 9 years old there was something that Jesus was going to be able to do that you could not do yourself.
Absolutely.
Right?
I 100% knew that then. I just didn't know what I had to own in that process at 9 years old to kind of not necessarily, or to kind of like help be an influence.
Well, that's what's interesting about your story too. And I think this is true of a lot of people though, what you said about ownership. Like, talk about some of the instances over the next couple of years. You know, after 9, you're trying to follow Jesus in a 9-year-old way, but you know, you become an adult, you start owning different parts of your life. What did God do to help you start to own new pieces of that following Jesus faith?
Yeah, got me out of the little small town that I grew up in. Went to school here at Murray State, and you know, I started to hear and started to see other opinions, other viewpoints, started to have some discussions that really almost challenged my faith at times. I don't want to say questioned what I believe, but it definitely caused me to not necessarily feel like everything that I was told as a child was like 100% accurate, right? And so there was a time outside of college where I was just like, I'm just going to step away from this for a little while.
Yeah.
And in 2010, actually was diagnosed with cancer, and my whole world kind of was shaken up during that moment. And I remember very vividly somebody telling me a few days after I got diagnosed, was like, well, God will never give you more than you can handle. Right. And I was like, I don't know that that's true. Because there were definitely moments during that time period where it was like, I don't know if I can handle this anymore. Right. And, you know, dealt with that for a year and a half, coming out into remission, and really still not fully grasping a whole lot of like where I still fit into the whole puzzle. It wasn't until after, and it was almost like, you had all of these people that were around you while you were going through your treatment, but then the treatment ends, and like those people are like, all right, he's better now, our job's done.
Yeah.
That's how it felt. that wasn't necessarily the reality of it. So you run into this moment, and my wife and I were newly married at the time. And so you have this moment where there's almost like this emptiness, but that emptiness coming out of the cancer treatment was probably the most alone that I had felt in that moment, because you weren't so busy with everything else during that moment. And nobody really prepares you for life after cancer.
Yeah.
Especially as a newly married couple, having to get plugged back into the workforce and still not feeling great. And so that was probably the moment where we started experimenting with different churches. I'll throw out some names during this time. Mackenzie and Brett, who were both going to Journey at the time. I think Matt and Jen were helping them at a wedding expo. And, Matt just casually came over, introduced himself, invited us to church. And it wasn't until really after that moment that we were like, okay, let's give this church a shot, right? And I don't want to say it was like instantaneous, like we walked into the doors of the Curris Center and like our eyes were open, and but all of a sudden we started seeing in our minds what church should look like, what community should look like. And it really gave us almost over time like a sense of belonging, because all of a sudden we had people that we could share our struggles with, the things that we were dealing with in our lives. And it really felt like there were people there that genuinely cared about our well-being, and not necessarily were there to try to fix it, but just help us walk alongside that. Because post-cancer, there was, the financial ramifications of having to deal with that, but then there was also, there was infertility that we were dealing with, and that was a very, very dark chapter for my wife and I. And, there was a moment that we had actually moved away from Murray to live in Owensboro for a year and a half, and that was the darkest that our marriage had been, because what community we had built, we left to go to Owensboro, and all of a sudden it was just my wife and I. I mean, my parents were there, but there was only so much you can open up with your parents about when it comes to all of those things in life. And so it wasn't really until we came back to Murray that we started to feel a little bit of peace about where we were in our current stage of life. We weren't happy with it, but there was just this weird sense of peace. And then once we found that peace was when we started diving deeper into our community. And before we knew it, it was like there was this whole group of people that were here to support us through the infertility side of our journey.
Yeah. So for you, it wasn't so much finding answers to those questions and doubts you had in college, but there were people to walk through all of that stuff with you as you had those questions and doubt. Is that kind of to sum up?
For sure, yeah. Well, the determinations that I had made in those years through college, that, the questions that I did have, it wasn't that I necessarily needed answers to them. I think I just needed to see people living the way that Jesus really wants us to live, right? Because I don't want to say that I didn't have examples of that growing up. I had great examples of that growing up, but it wasn't examples that I necessarily wanted to emulate like step for step. And it wasn't until I came here that all of a sudden it was like, oh, there are, I click a lot better with the group that I'm surrounding myself with now from a Christianity standpoint than what I grew up with.
So for you, this transition into adulthood was carrying this ownership of this new way of life and trying to follow Jesus that way. You had good models to help you follow Jesus in this world you were living in, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
Well, then let's talk about today.
Okay.
What is it that you think God is doing with you right now and helping you move toward growth or faith in right now?
Yeah, I think it's really easy sometimes for us to get to a point in our life where we're like, man, I don't know that God really has anything that he's working through me on right now, right? And it's like, I was about this time last year, I almost felt like I was in that moment, right? They're like, oh man, things are good. We are
never gonna have any problems.
Yeah, we are maintaining altitude. Things are great. And then last summer, we found out that the company that I worked for was selling, being acquired. And so all of a sudden, there's a million questions that pop up, right? Like, do I still have a job? What is my job going to be? Right. Am I going to have to move? Are we still going to be able to make Western Kentucky home?
Right.
And so you have all of those questions that are coming out, and I don't want to say that I questioned the decision that had been made. I completely trust my work situation that, you know, my leadership knows exactly what they're doing long term, and they're doing it for the betterment of the people that work there. Completely agree with that. But you still sit there and go, what does it really mean?
Yeah, what is it? That's right.
What does it really mean whenever the ink is dried and, you know, you are no longer what you were 4 months prior? And so I'm in that season right now that things are going well and the transition has been great, but you still, in your mind, you have to trust, in my instance, I have to trust God with that like, the situation's good. I'm not looking for anywhere else to work right now because, like, I trust the situation that I am. I trust that God has control of that. And sometimes that's hard to do, especially if you're a type A personality like me who wants to have all the answers and wants to have everything figured out. But there are just some things you just kind of have to let go and trust whatever happens, happens. And I have struggled with that, but I feel like that is probably the one thing in our lives right now that we are like, okay, we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And so for you right now, you're saying, man, the security that you once felt, you're having to depend on God for, not just the way you've produced things in your life, right? There's a different sort of trust there for,
Absolutely.
Man, whatever's coming next, God, I know you're with me in it. That's really powerful. That's a powerful lesson. Thank you for reminding us all of that. Paul, thank you. We're going to learn more about your story, I'm sure, when we do this live on stage. You guys, man, thank you to Paul for doing this, though, in a short form and digging in a little bit. It's helped me, encourage me today. So
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Guys.